All right, welcome to the lecture on the Ford and Carter years, or the sucky 70s. Let's get the old sharing going. Gerald Ford, of course, becoming president after Richard Nixon's resignation. Ford coming from Michigan, the only person never to actually be elected president to fill the position. But he had been Speaker of the House. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned for various crimes. And so Ford had moved up to the vice presidency. And then once Nixon resigned, Ford moved up again to the presidency. He's only going to be president for a couple of years. Probably the most noteworthy thing about Gerald Ford is there were two assassination attempts on his life. One was by Manson follower and General Nutjob Squeaky Fromme. I forgot who the other one was. That he kept tripping a lot. He would trip going upstairs, going downstairs. A very klutzy man, which is kind of odd because he apparently had been a really good football player back in college. We've already seen some of Ford in Vietnam. He will be the president who is in charge when South Vietnam finally collapses completely. Ford considered inflation to be the country's biggest problem, the greatest threat to the United States. And you can bet this is going to be mercilessly mocked by everybody. But he's unable to make really any headway against this, okay? The inflation is not going anywhere for a couple of reasons. He can't raise taxes without pissing off the right. And he can't cut government spending without pissing off the left. And oil shock prices. Now remember, Ford had not been elected president, so he doesn't have a base the way that Nixon had a base. When you're running for president, once you get the nomination, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes deal cutting that has to go on. And since Ford had never run for president, he didn't really have any type of base. So any move he made would piss off either side of the aisle, the left or the right. And then he's got the oil shock problems as well. So he's really not going to make any headway on dealing with this oil crisis problem. Frankly, I see no other reason to spend any more time with the man's presidency. So let's move on to Jimmy Carter. Carter pretty much ran against all the presidents, against LBJ, Nixon, and Ford. This is something we're going to look at in a few moments. But after Watergate, there was an explosion of investigative reporters digging up all kinds of dirt on politics. Let me give you just a few headlines here. This is 1973. This is 1 month in 1973. 2 Chicago councilmen indicted for accepting bribes. Mayor of Miami indicted for taking bribes. Former governor of Illinois convicted and sent to prison for conspiracy, perjury, fraud, and income tax evasion. Democratic state legislature in Delaware indicted for distributing 40 pounds of heroin. Over the next year and a half, a dozen Nixon administration officials had to resign. 2 former U.S. attorney generals were indicted. 1 went to jail. Former congressman from Pennsylvania convicted of mail fraud. Sitting congressman from New York indicted for helping the mafia get a hold of government contracts. Indicted for perjury. Mayor of Camden. Lieutenant Governor of California. Former Chief Judge of U.S. Customs Court. Chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Police misconduct in Indianapolis, Philadelphia, and New York City. Business corruption by American Airlines, Braniff, 3M, Gulf Oil. So Carter kind of ran against all of the sleaze of the 1970s. Okay. He made a promise that he would never lie to the American people. He came across as a honest, God-fearing, Sunday school teaching man. He still teaches Sunday school. Didn't cheat on his wife, and their 75th anniversary is coming up here in a few days. So a very honest, clean person that Americans felt they would be able to trust again. Where is old President Carter? There he is. He's probably the most respected ex-president because he's out there building houses for poor people while he battles cancer. Oh. All right. But his presidency is going to be hampered by many of the problems that have been hampering the presidents who came before him. Essentially, his presidency, basically 3 elements that undercut Carter's presidency. One will be, of course, the entire Republican Party in opposition to him. Second will be the economy. Again, we've got inflation, and there'll be another oil shock. And then third, his own party, particularly the left wing of the Democratic Party. Carter felt why has the left bothered him? Carter felt there were some government programs that could be better run by the private sector. Okay. And and he was not a fan of universal health insurance, which Republicans have been trying to get passed since the Truman administration. And so this sort of put him, now what he was in favor of was essentially what the ACA did. You have to have insurance or face a penalty. And then he felt that the government should then provide what he called catastrophic health insurance. So that put him against the left. As far as the economy goes, here's a new word for you. Stagflation. What is stagflation? Stagflation is unemployment and inflation go up at the same time. Remember, we have been told that unemployment and inflation run in opposite directions. We now know that's not true because in the 1970s, we had this wonderful thing called stagflation, where unemployment and inflation were going up at the same time. Carter's administration, which we're going to look at particularly with his foreign policy, but the other thing that begins to show up in Carter's administration, something that will be very important in the 1980s, what is called the New Right. And the New Right was essentially three separate currents that sort of met to form the New Right. Current number one were conservative evangelicals concerned about abortion and that their racially segregated private academies could lose tax-exempt status. Two, are the old Goldwater Republicans. Barry Goldwater had run for president back in 1964, and he had remained a popular, even though he had lost, he'd remained popular with certain parts of the Republican Party, mainly those looking for limited government. And were against women's rights and affirmative action. And then finally, the third group that came together was the crowd, the portion that was concerned about taxes and spending. The Grover Norquist crowd would come from this side. Grover Norquist, you can look him up. He's this famous guy who makes people running for office sign a pledge that they won't raise taxes. And if you want his support and his mailing list and the support of his people who follow him, you have to sign his dumb pledge. So you have some of these people are coming from a religious background. Some of them just want a limited government that doesn't try to interfere with day-to-day Basically, these were people who would also be against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And trying to type too fast. And then the old anti-tax and spend crowd. So these three groups came together in the 1970s, and they'll be very important for the 1980s, 1990s, and so on and so forth. This new right, of course, still existing. Very conservative, intensely political, and intensely anti-Carter. And we'll see what will happen, because these guys will basically come together to get Reagan and then later the Bushes into office, and we'll sort of see what happens there. The other thing we're going to look at with Carter when we get to foreign policy, Iran and Afghanistan are also going to begin on Carter's watch, and so we'll get to those as well. But to get back to the sort of sordidness of the 70s, there were a lot of problems. There were a lot of problems with education. It turns out that a lot of people had been hiring people to take the LSAT and the MCAT for them. These are the tests you have to take to get into law school or medical school. West Point cadets were being expelled for cheating. SAT scores were dropping. Kids were, basically not learning as much as they had. You could get college courses in belly dancing, the dropping of required courses in English and history, SAT scores dropping 10% throughout the 1970s. So the government decided to put together a committee called the Wirtz Committee to try to figure out what the heck was up with education. And why was the education, why weren't kids learning as much as they used to? Well, first thing the Wirtz Committee said was that excessive TV viewing was the problem. And as someone who used to do his homework while watching TV, I will agree with that. Easier textbooks. And then finally, what the Wirtz Committee referred to as a decade of distraction, meaning it was much more fun to get super high and have sex while listening to rock music than it was to do one's algebra homework, is basically what the Wirtz Committee is getting there. And so this led to attempts to fix education, new math, whole word reading instead of phonics. Nothing really helped. Test scores continued to plummet. Math scores continue to plummet. I don't know where the U.S. ranks anymore. I've stopped paying attention, but here we are. But to be honest, even in the 1960s and 50s, the U.S. was not exactly at the top of the education system in terms of worldwide rankings. We've always been somewhat of a middling country when it comes to education. 70s are also known for the Third Great Awakening. There have been two previous Great Awakenings. One was way back in the 1730s. The other was after the War of 1812. This is the Third Great Awakening. And this sort of grew out of the 1960s, particularly what was called the Jesus movement in the 1960s. And so the winners here were the more southern conservative denominations. And when I say winner, basically I mean more people were going to these churches. So the Southern Baptists, the Methodists, the Evangelicals, these were the people who saw their membership numbers going up. And we've seen that with presidents. We've had 2 Baptist presidents, Carter and Clinton. The second George Bush was a Methodist. Ronald Reagan was an evangelical. I don't know what Obama was. The mainline Protestants lost members. Okay. Protestants lost members. And so this would be your Disciples of Christ, Lutherans, Episcopalians, people like that. There's also the rise of Christian publishing, Christian radio, Christian TV, Christian music. Again, all of this sort of coming out of the Jesus movement. By 1980, there were 1,400 religious radio stations. There were 66 cable TV stations that were completely dedicated to religious broadcasting. So people like Oral Roberts, Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, Pat Robertson, all coming out of this movement. There's also growth in what I'm going to call, and it's probably a better name, but what we would call third world religions. So Hare Krishna, Buddhism, transcendental meditation, yoga. These aren't all religions. Some of them are just Eastern practices, but adherence to these also growing up in the United States in the 1970s. And then finally, film and television. Watergate had a profound effect on film and television in the 1970s in 2 ways, really. Reflection or escape. And so we see a lot of films in the 1970s that are about either reflecting the sleaze or trying to escape it. And so a movie like Serpico, which is about a corrupt New York City police department, is a reflection. But even going into the past, okay, The Godfather, who's corrupt in The Godfather? The cops are corrupt, the politicians are corrupt. The only people who have any sort of honor are the mobsters, okay? Chinatown, going back to the 1930s, again, we have corruption amongst government employees. We have some incest as well, okay? Robert Altman's Nashville. Nashville predicted, and rightly so, that politics was simply going to become another form of entertainment. And on that, Altman was correct. So in all these areas, we see a reflection of the sort of Watergate sleaze being reflected back to the American people, whether it's in the present, whether it's in the past. The other theme was escape, all right? And so we see, for instance, John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. Okay? His version of escape is going down to this disco where he is essentially the king of this disco. Okay? He works in a hardware store for minimum wage, but in this building, in this disco, which is called 2001, he can escape from the outside world. The other version of escape was to simply go back to the 50s and 60s, American Graffiti. Where were you in 62? So this is before John F. Kennedy's assassination, before we went off to Vietnam, before the oil shocks. Right. Also Grease, going back to the 50s, again, escaping the current 70s, and then even on TV as well, going back to the 1950s. And of course, the biggest escape of them all being an escape to a galaxy far, 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 far away. Okay? George Lucas has repeatedly stated that Star Wars would not have been a hit in the early 1970s because we needed those Watergate years, that defeat in Vietnam, and all the sludge and filth and poison that came crawling to the surface, 1973, 74, 75, and so on. That's what made Star Wars such a success, as it provided an escape from the 70s. All right. In our next video, we will look at foreign policy of the particularly Carter years, but also the Reagan years, because we're going to get into Afghanistan. And I will see you there. All right, in the next video.